So welcome to the Meyerstein Lecture in Archaeology 2026 with Professor Sturt Manning. Just to do a bit of housekeeping, if you want the toilets and the bathrooms, out that door there and through to the left. The fire exit's clearly labelled over there. It is getting quite warm in here. I'm going to leave that door open for now. It doesn't seem to be air conditioning. So if there becomes a problem with noise, if at the back you could close it for us, if we have anyone out there, that'd be great. Thank you. Professor Ramsey.
Okay, yes, so I want to welcome you on behalf of the school. So the Meyerstein Lecture is a kind of highlight of our academic year, and it's a very special moment for us. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this year, which is Sturt Manning, who's a long-time friend and collaborator of people in the School of Archaeology here, going back, I think, more than almost 30 years. So it's been a very long time, particularly on Aegean archaeology, but also on sort of radiocarbon and dendrochronology. So Sturt is a prime example of an interdisciplinary archaeologist. From his first degree in ANU and his master's in Macquarie, he's had a focus on the archaeology of the Mediterranean world, including the sort of straddling the classical side and also the prehistoric aspects of archaeology, and a particular focus, I think, on the Aegean. For his doctorate, he moved then to Cambridge and also had a junior research fellowship there. And to give us, I guess, a picture of what he's working on in those eras, I think your thesis title was Before Daedalus, The Origins of Complex Society and the Genesis of the State in Crete. So you can kind of see the type of thing he was working on in that period. But he was quick to see, I think, in that work, the importance of getting really good chronology as you unpick what's going on in the developments in society. And so from early stage, he lent quite heavily on scientific techniques, particularly on dendrochronology and radiocarbon. And he's been not only a user of those, because I think there's kind of a lot of archaeologists who end up using radiocarbon and dendrochronology in their research, but as a driver of the actual methods themselves as well. So from Cambridge, he then moved to Reading with roles, I think, in both classics and archaeology faculties there. And it was at that stage that we started collaborating, particularly on the radiocarbon dating, that to begin with, on the chronology of Aegean. But then, because the chronology of the Aegean, as many of you will know, is quite complicated and difficult, that led to all other kinds of scientific investigations into radiocarbon, and particularly into the radiocarbon calibration curve. So he's also a key member of the INTCAL working group, which works on the calibration curve much more generally. So from Reading, he moved briefly to Toronto as the chair in Aegean prehistory, and then to Cornell, where he is now, the Distinguished Professor of Arts and Sciences in Classics, and also the director of the Cornell Tree Ring Laboratory. And if that's not a busy enough job, and he's also adjunct professor in the Cyprus Institute as well, so keeping that link with the archaeology of that region. So I think his talk today is going to be, I guess, it looks from the title a bit more on the scientific side, but I wanted to highlight that he's done all kinds of other archaeology, social archaeology and archaeology of the Aegean region as well. And so this is just one aspect really of what he's working on. So his talk today is, as you can see here, on identifying climate changes that matter in the past and are for future relevance. So hand over to you. Welcome, Sturt.
Well, hello. Thank you all very much for coming out, since I'm told there's a danger of a major thunderstorm by the end of the evening. So thank you. And you may have a different government by the time we get to the end of the lecture, with which I have no involvement. But I apologize if... But of course, the joke is causation and correlation are not the same thing. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about climate change and archaeology, and I'm going to talk about what some of the potentials are, but equally part of the talk is going to be trying to highlight that some of the work that's gone on to date, the linkage between the correlation and the causation and the real history has not always been demonstrated. And I think a lot more care is needed in the next generation of work in archaeology and climate to try and tie these things together really solidly. So when today you normally mention the subject of climate, people particularly are thinking of climate change, and they're thinking about diagrams like this one that just got put out in the US. Remarkably, some climate science still happens in the US, despite there is no such thing as climate change. I should have paid that as the official position of the country in which I currently work. But despite that, you'll notice that there seems to be a lot of change going on. Everything that's in these sort of browny reddy colors is telling you it's different from average, and it's hitting the darker the color, the more non-average. And around the world, in a recent Pew Research survey, the green bar, this is the percentage of the people surveyed who think that climate change might be a relevant factor or something to worry about. Now, you will notice that the USA is the lowest one. It's barely over half. But many other countries, 3/4 of the population, think that this is a sort of a real thing to be a little bit concerned about. And when did we all start getting really upset and bothered about this? It was particularly when we realized that carbon dioxide was changing in the atmosphere pretty dramatically, literally within our lifetimes, as opposed to something that's been going on for millennia or centuries, which, as we all know, if it's been going on for that long, who cares? It must be normal, this type of thing. But when you produce a graph that looks like this, in which you have seemingly carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doing this, and then suddenly it's literally a vertical line, depending on the x-axis scale you pick, or you blow it up, pretty much an exponential takeoff, and only in the period really since about World War II, the so-called Keeling curve, for those who are sort of into climate-y type things, people said something's not on, and it's not right. And a book like this one by Brannon nicely argues and makes the point that if we basically double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and we are today, we're all going to be facing the prospect of being, somewhere between not well and dead, meaning it's starting to become a critical issue for the survival of the planet. And the major culprit, of course, was recognized as being fossil fuels all going into the atmosphere, my picture on the top. Now, one approach here, of course, is just to start the blame game. It's a very normal human thing to do, and I suspect we've all done that. We all know you have an argument with somebody. The normal thing is to make sure it's their fault rather than yours. So we could start blaming people. Britain was pretty early in on the Industrial Revolution, so of course we're at fault, and we probably should have some sort of Industrial Revolution admission of guilt statement at the beginning of talks like this. But the US, of course, is by far the most responsible in many ways, but Russia, China, all the big countries are pretty much out there doing their very best to put as much CO2 into the atmosphere as possible until very recently. And all of a sudden, there's been some awareness that we should do something about this. So that's one aspect of the climate scenario. But the fact that it became, post sort of Al Gore onwards, a real topic, predictably, archaeology has started to take it very seriously. And in the last 20 years, basically, and maybe you could even argue in the last 16, 17 years, there's been a climate turn, you could say, in archaeology and history. And from being a very niche topic where there were just every now and again somebody would say, oh, well, maybe there was something going on at the end of the Roman world. Could that have been relevant? It's something where it's all over the place, major articles appearing, and the popular media are picking this up and find always interesting ways of illustrating what they see as climate, meaning the end of the Roman world. This particular one, because it was snow, does strike me as a slightly odd one to go with, but nonetheless, there's been this change and this shift. And an example that I'm going with here of, focus on climate, it's very typical in archaeology. When we're in the period of, for example, the Vietnam War and the anti-war protests, suddenly there was literature that was about war and role in society and so on. Other times when we had the environmental turn, this applied. We're in the sort of climate turn, and if were he still alive and writing another history of archaeology, Bruce Trigger would be spotting that this was another sort of shift in a pattern of intellectual history that we've got. And I pick on Eric Klein's book, not because particularly against it, although I will highlight the one key fact that 1177 is most definitely not the correct year in which this went down. That's on the chronological bit. He's using the wrong Egyptian chronology, but we'll ignore that. But the point is, in 2014, when the first edition of his book came out, he listed lots of things that could be causing the collapse of civilization. we don't even have to go into the fact there is no such thing as a collapse of civilization. But we'll just leave that as for whatever. But the end of this late Bronze Age period that he was talking about, he listed all sorts of things. And by the time he got to the second edition of this book in 2021, climate had suddenly become the factor which had to be pushed on. And he was making this a big thing. And we get, the updated edition that quotes Adam Gopnik writing, astonishing with eerie relevance. And it's just demonstrating that we write a history that is about today. And you can find many quotes which say, the past is only ever studied in terms of the present. So climate has become this topic that we're all working on. But, and very much the sort of point for this talk, I think that work of Karl Butzer, and particularly like an article they published in PNAS now 14 years ago, he highlighted the real problem when he writes, current research in historical collapse suggests a primary fascination with climatic change and environmental degradation as primary agents of change, but the cost of less attention to the necessary cross-disciplinary integration. Indeed, the recent return to environmentalism is not about a fresh interest in the environment-society interface, but a continuing failure to appreciate the complexity of such interrelationships. And as a sort of little quick summary, climate has many influences on us, but in no way does it call for or demand a particular societal solution. So it's always a very complicated process, however extreme or minor climate change might be. Nor is climate change ever homogeneous, and we see that even today. So here we have a couple of maps showing climate change recently in North America. Again, there is actually still people trying to record this in North America at present. And what you'll immediately spot is the pattern's quite varied across one continent. Some places are drier than they used to be, others aren't. Some are cooler than they used to be, others aren't. Some are warmer than they used to be, and other places aren't. And if we put up the previous year, we'll spot slightly different patterns. So this is the big issue. It's a very non-homogeneous process. And recent statement from somebody here in the UK as an expert goes nicely with this, looking at the last year, in which she comments, a reminder the climate system can sometimes simultaneously deliver very cold weather in one region and extreme heat in another. While human activities continue to drive long-term warming, these recent events highlight that resilience and adaptation to increasing extremes are key to prepare society for heightened climate risk in the future. So yes, things are changing. Yes, they seem to be more extremes, but it's wrong to just say, oh, the little ice age happened and that's a general explanation. Oh, the late antique little ice age happened. That's a general explanation for what happened. The response in any particular place, according to place and people, can be and probably was in many cases very different. And there's a fundamental difference also between what we call in the climate science low frequency things and high frequency things. So low frequency means something that takes place on a sort of centennial to a millennial or beyond basis. So you're thinking very long little waves like this. High frequency means it's changing like now, this month, this year, these couple of years, but not decades and not centuries and not so and so. And my general argument, which I'll be making with a couple of the cases, humans don't make decisions based on low frequency changes. They don't even notice them, not unless they're historians. And so Pliny the Elder, for example, does comment on the fact that certain types of trees did certain things according to a different author, Theophrastus. They don't seem to do so today. So maybe that's changed over a period of centuries. Fascinating. But no one's making a decision based on that. Whereas when we notice the fact that every day for the next month there is an incredible lightning thunderstorm outside, we are going to make a decision like getting a better weatherproof coat, buying another umbrella. So high frequency things force us to decide how we're actually living our lives right now. So a variety of books you can pick on, and we can just pick on Brock, for example, have made the case that low frequency changes in climate are probably pretty well associated with various aspects of human evolution from the Pleistocene through to the Holocene, and no one's really going to dispute that. And similarly, this, regarded here by Dagmar de Groot, makes pretty much similar types of arguments. But as the Philip Blom book, which I pick on as an example, he highlights the fact that, of course, if you look at a little bit more narrow historical scales, so starting to verge into the more higher frequency rather than the very long general low frequency, that trying to draw sort of casual connections between apparent shift in climate, like the Little Ice Age, like the medieval warm period before it, usually doesn't work very well, and that very different things happen in different places. You have very different responses. And what was the Gilded Dutch Age, otherwise the Little Ice Age, you have a terrific success, apparently, effectively, in terms of one state at a time when other places supposedly are suffering from the negative effects of the very same phenomenon. So you can't just generalize and write a history based on low frequency. And things are not always bad. One of the sort of general statements you can make about climatic science in terms of archaeology history is it's all about disasters. It's about collapse. And in fact, that was why I stuck up the Harvey Weiss book on the top here. I mean, if you talk about ancient climate, what do people think about? Mega drought and collapse. I'm still waiting to actually discover any positive evidence there's ever been a mega drought, which is an interesting thing because no one on Earth, so far as anybody, demonstrated a drought that is continuous for centuries, as is suggested in several of the papers in this volume. You can have drier episodes, but you tend to have variations within those, but you can talk about shifts to more arid climate, but you don't get necessarily a mega drought. But as this paper argues here by Dalpoin-Geddes and Karl-Bopinski, at other places in the world, we can find shifts, even shifts that could be described as to somewhat more negative conditions affecting some places in a region, and actually ends up driving societal change, increased trade and connections. So climate can often be a force for positive social growth, you would argue. And the most famous sort of one is the Roman period, where you can point to the fact that a couple of times in the Roman era, you get warmer temperatures and not a single major volcano is known either in the Roman period or in the medieval warm period. So these seem to be both relatively stable periods, no major volcanoes, which is one of the short-term drivers of climate change that we experience in the course of a few years and can cause major negative effects. And we have this period of a couple of centuries, which is well above average in terms of temperature, which for many parts of the world is actually a good thing. Right now, we think we're getting a little bit too much of a good thing. And of course, that's the whole point. It depends where you are, and it also depends how much of a good thing it is. But we shouldn't see climate as being just a negative factor. So it's a question of what are the effects in a given place and what type of timescale. So lots of people are starting to say we need to think about the story, not just in terms of the big picture, but in terms of the details. So some papers like these two make good cases for a general ability to correlate certain periods of the longer term past against some climatic changes. And as I say, in the period from the Pleistocene to the early Holocene, few would now disagree that there isn't a reasonable association of broad low frequency climate changes and shifts and patterns in human evolution and at the beginning of practices like, for example, farming beginning nearly all over the world at approximately the same time, given similar sort of climate shifts and changes going on. But back to Butzer and his critique. So I read out the little first part, but he then concludes with his statement. He observes with reference to Western Europe since about 1200 CE, he says, this more recent historical experience suggests that environmental or economic disasters do not necessarily lead to social breakdown or collapse. Because up to about that point, and in particular, Harvey Weiss was one of his bad guys in terms of who was he writing this about. Weiss had been arguing for some years that because there seemed to be some sort of climate shift, so-called rapid climate change, the RCC, around the 4.2 kiloyear event, so about 2,200 and a bit BCE, this was meant to have seen the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, was meant to have seen shifts all over lower latitude Northern Hemisphere. And Butzer's point was pretty much why. If you're in some marginal environment and it becomes significantly drier, yes, you're at risk. You either move start a different form of food production, maybe move to pastoralism versus growing crops, you have to do something. But if you're not in a marginal situation, you may be shifted to a slightly less favorable one, or you may be shifted towards a more favorable one. That's the sort of the Chinese case in the sense of it's bringing into other economic activities. But you don't just collapse because there's been a bit of a shift in the climate. Humans are incredibly good at adapting to things. And in fact, the whole argument with the low frequency one, humans over time have been incredibly good at adapting to all climate changes that have happened on Earth for the last several million years. What they're not going to be good at adapting to or can't adapt to is a fairly immediate and abrupt change in climate or any other of the parameters that drive your lives. So that's the type of thing that's going to force some sort of immediate response if it's not sort of immediately fatal to start with. So how do we manage to lead to social breakdown and collapse? What causes collapse and what causes social breakdown? So in a paper which, without just promoting one's own self, one of the things that I tried to argue for a little while now and seems to have got some traction with some people, but I think it's fair to say that the climate and past group has become its own little lobby now. It's inherently important because they're doing it, therefore it's inherently important. And they don't like it if people start suggesting, well, maybe we need to worry about what we're doing, because if we don't do it well, it's not actually good science and it's not good history either. And one of the factors is, if you make an allegation saying there's this climate change and appears to occur at about the same time as this social or economic change, is it caused by that? Do you have just a correlation or you have a causal association? Now, often and many times, the time is a problem. And this isn't going to be a talk on the chronology, but we can go back to Mike Bailey and his famous discussion of Sakin and smear. If you haven't read the article, it's a classic of its own sort, in which many times, because you have some event which is approximately dated that's big, and you have some other evidence that's very major, and it's about the same time, you do the obvious. You correlate the two together unless you can actually disprove that from some form of absolute dating evidence. And we've seen many such instances in archaeological history in the last many decades, in which things are sort of put together, and it's usually over time, then they get broken apart because people say, oh, it doesn't actually work when we've spent lots of money now and time trying to really nail it down. So there's a great tendency to stick things together rather than asking the other way around, which is, are there good reasons to put these things together before we make that assumption? And then we can investigate. So a perfect example of this is the last paragraph in Ulf Bunkton's et al.'s 2016 paper. This is the one in which they invent and create the late antique Little Ice Age, the so-called Lalia, in which the bold part of the text just nicely illustrates everything that's just being overly generalized and smushed. So a causal nexus between volcanic-induced 6th century unprecedented thermal shock and subsequent plague outbreaks, rising and falling empires, human migrations, and political upheaval requires caution. They then carry on a bit. Then it's, in light of the still inadequate understanding of the various push-pull factors that may have been involved in long-distance population movements, the role they played in human history. And then they mention they need to overcome reductionist approaches. Well, they're being pretty reductionist in this case. And only at the very end, my sentence I put in red, they go, case-by-case assessment will further increase our perception of the environmental conditions under which historical events occurred. I wasn't a reviewer of this paper, but if I had been, I might have suggested that really focusing on the last sentence and demonstrating that the rest of the paper that went before it would have been should have been the real focus of the paper, rather than alleging that they found this really important new climate driver for history and basically the end of the Roman Empire and all sorts of related things. And only in the last sentence admitting that maybe we need to look at all the instances carefully to figure out if this really works. But this is very much typically how climate history and archaeology have carried things on for the last little while. So an example, which some people in this university were involved in, is this paper on the Okmok volcano in Alaska. It was a very big volcanic eruption. No one disputes that. And it probably is dated about 43, based on reasonably good ice core evidence and other information. The question, of course, is the title. it says effects on the late Roman Republic and Ptolemaic kingdom. Now, that's not objectionable. It may well have had some effects on them. But of course, if anybody's read the paper, and at least even the abstract, it doesn't just suggest there might have been effects. It goes on to argue that the end of the Roman Republic is basically caused by this volcanic eruption. And the press release that went with the paper most certainly said that, because all of the media, like the one I've just picked something from the media, that's what they announced that this paper had discovered, that apparently the Roman Republic ended because of this great volcanic eruption. Now, some other people thought it had something to do with Caesar being assassinated rather than a big volcano, but that's by the by. And of course, there was also this Pompey character over here, in case you know this. Now, why were they doing this? Well, it turned out, of course, that there was more than one volcano at this time. It was been argued for years that there'd been an eruption of Etna at about this time, and there probably still was. And it had been mentioned, a person called Phyllis Forsyth, this article here on the top left, had argued that maybe this had something to do with the timing and changes that were going on. In particular, it explains some of the sort of supernatural occurrences which were associated by some of the ancient authors with this period. And, well, as probably still today, but ancient writers often tried to explain dynasty change and other sorts of major things by a certain supernatural and gods involved. So the fact that there were certain apparitions and colors in the sky, this was telling us this was a moment of importance. Just as going much earlier, a millennium earlier, Shamshadadi, when he was born, supposedly there was a great eclipse. So these things were meant to go together. And we get told, for example, from her article on this, she quotes Seneca, "It's recorded in history that day, the deified Augustus entered Rome in his return from Apollonia. A circle of varied colors was seen around the sun, colors that usually appear in a rainbow," etc. And maybe this was because of a volcanic aerosol in the atmosphere, is the argument. Now, in the paper, which argues the volcano was all important, it seems like it must have been a really important fact to the local historians otherwise. But if we look at Plutarch's Life of Caesar and the relevant bit, most of it's about other things. It's about the fact Cassius committed suicide with the same sword that he'd used to attack Caesar. It tells us about all sorts of things, and only in the little bit that I've put in green does it mention the fact that during this year the orb rose pale and without radiance while the heat that came. So there seems to have been some cooling going on, which may very well have been because of a major volcanic eruption. No one's going to dispute that. But the historian writing doesn't seem to feel that this is the all-important fact. The all-important fact is more to do with many other factors. When we look at the paper, they calculate the diminished temperature, and it looks quite dramatic. And they do one of these global climate models that tries to come up with an impressive amount of blue, which tells you the temperature's gone way down. No dispute on that. But the really interesting thing is how they try to explain this. So they have this very clever graphic, which in responding to another critic, they then improved the graphic. But the argument is that the little reddy pink line represents when the eruption happened, hence the massive cooling here. And interestingly, you'll spot that with the various bars they've got up above, this all seems to have been caused, or at least temporarily closely associated with the volcanic eruption. But it isn't really, because they tell us that there were food shortages in Rome and they were caused by the volcanic eruption. But we know from a number of other ancient authors that Peter Garnsey summarizes in 2 pages and many citations that there were major food shortages in Rome starting in about 49 BCE. So that's 6 years before the eruption. And they tell us that things were cut off because of the eruption and then they changed. But what we actually know is that Sextus Pompeius, a figure who really has not got his fair spot in Roman history, to be honest, and that's because victors always write the stories, and he was on the losing side. Augustus became the emperor in Rome and took over. But he basically was blockading in a very successful and perhaps arguably more effective than the Hormuz Strait situations going on in our present world. He was blockading Italy and particularly Rome for years, based with his fleet in Sicily. And this is what was causing the food shortages in Rome. And we get told this quite specifically. So although there is an impressive assembly of data here, and I'm not disputing the ice core analysis or anything that suggests that there's temperature change and so on, I'm sure that it's all approximately correct and the dating is approximately correct. But we have a lot of other evidence which indicates that human factors, and very often we are the problem as opposed to what's going on with natural forces, that very human factors to do with politics, people, dynasties between rival aristocratic factions, basically in Rome, they appear to be causing the food shortages in Rome, not this volcanic eruption. Of course, the volcanic eruption may have worsened the situation. So very often, climate may contribute to something, or it may provide a background to which we then contribute, but not so often is it just the cause as is. And so if you look at all the facts in Roman history from a standard sort of textbook account, I have just inserted there, but it's just one of many, many things that are going on in a very short period at the time of the sort of, decline of the Roman Republic. It's hardly the thing that should be in 50-point font and in bright red. Is this the only such case? One could go on and on this, but I'm just going to go with one other one, which is the end of the Late Bronze Age. This is the same thing that Eric's book is talking about, and it is a period of notable shifts. A number of civilizations seem to go through some form of major reorganization or change at the end of the Late Bronze Age, and that means somewhere around about 1200 BCE, or some years later, or even 1177 if you want to be Eric. And in particular, we know something about it because we have inscriptions which were put up by the Egyptian pharaoh, because alone out of all of the great powers in the ancient Near East, the Egyptian pharaoh, and that would be him personally, the big guy, he drove back invaders that had come to attack Egypt, the so-called Sea Peoples, and they survived, and he writes all about it, whereas every other place had been laid waste, had been made silent, and so on. So we know something was going on, and there's been years and years and years of trying to figure out what was going on. And in the first book, Eric considered earthquakes, internal rebellions, invaders, decentralization, the rise of the private merchant, sea peoples, disease, or perhaps climate change, drought, and famine. And by the time we get to the second edition on page 157, taken as a whole, the evidence now points rather conclusively to a drought in the region that lasted at least 150 years and possibly 300 years, beginning about 1200 BC. So this is quite an extraordinary claim. Was he the first to do this? No. Carpenter, in his book Discontinuities in Greek Civilization that came out in 1966, he wondered about a drought. Robert Drews, an article in Astoria in 1992, mentioned that Herodotus talked about an 18-year famine in Anatolia, which maybe that had something to do with it. And my favorite bit, in footnote 7, Drews mentions that he had heard a report of some narrow tree rings at Gordian, that's in Anatolia, at this time. But then, much though most of the rest of the talk I'll use some dendro evidence, why doesn't he count it? Because it can't have been that bad, because it wasn't severe enough to kill the trees. Now, of course, on that basis, you'd never find anything in dendrochronology, because if the tree dies, that's the end of the record. And it's like, so I love that one. But anyway, so David Kaniewski, who Klein cites a lot, he goes a little bit more specifically, and he makes this really interesting comment, or he et al., I should point out, quote, "There are no written sources with direct information on climate for this period except Aristotle's statement about the Mycenaean drought about 1200 BCE. Now, this really caught my attention a few years ago when I first read this, because I thought, wow, I've suffered through quite a lot of classics classes. And of course, if I'm with my colleagues, I will make that more positively. Isn't it wonderful to read text together with colleagues that share like-minded things? They never take the slightest interest in archaeology, I should point out, in case you wonder. And as commented to Christopher, it's great you've got an archaeology community here, as opposed to it's a fairly isolationist world in the US on this regard. Anyway, and it has a footnote. So the footnote is this article by Neumann, Climate Change is a Topic in the Classical Greek and Roman Literature. So, of course, I rushed off to find out what on earth this was about. Well, what do we get? We get a reference to Aristotle's Meteorologica, and what we get told is that the same place is not always moist or dry, but a change in their character according to the appearance or failures of rivers. This is in a section in which rivers and what they're doing is very important to Aristotle, and this goes with his whole theory about how moisture and humus drives civilization and climate change and other things. These slow changes lead to different circumstances, and Aristotle sees the progression from new land that is too wet, Egypt is example writing, but this too wet land changes in its turn and in time becomes thriving. For as places dry, they improve, and places that formerly enjoyed a good climate deteriorate and grow too dry. And here's the bit that apparently they were relying on. This has happened in Greece to the land about Argos and Mycenae. In the time of the Trojan War, Argos was marshy and able to support few inhabitants only, while Mycenae was good land and therefore the more famous. Now the opposite is the case for the reason given above. I just mentioned the fact he's not even explicit in the above, but it's something about the local river. For Mycenae has become unproductive and completely dry, while the Argyle land that was once marshy and unproductive is now under cultivation. What has happened in this small district may therefore be supposed to have happened to large districts and whole countries. I don't see any mention of a Mycenaean drought there. If you're a textual expert, you can do better. But all he is saying is that somewhere between the time of the Trojan War, which Aristotle, like any Greek of his time, placed broadly speaking somewhere around 1200, give or take about 100 years BC, so at least 800 years before his own time, somewhere between then and his own time, there's been some shift between Argos and Mycenae, and they were often compared in some ways. So that's hardly a Mycenaean drought. That seems to be suggesting, and Aristotle's actually explicit, it's a change, which, as he says, a change that's so slow that it's invisible to humans. So he's really making a quite brilliant argument for my low frequency point, which is low frequency changes are important and the way the environment changes shapes human evolution and history, but we don't know anything about it because it's just gradually happening and we adapt to it. But it certainly is no evidence for a Mycenaean drought. So one could go on, but these are major articles being published in major and even leading journals, and yet the connection between climate and the history of archaeology could only be described as somewhat thin. Now, others have started to spot this, and we have really good paper by Christina Sessa, which critiqued some of the early work on the late Roman period and rather too easily saying that climate explained what we saw going on in the late Roman period. There's been more work coming out from ancient historians and archaeologists, like this book by Paul Oberkamp, which has lots of papers trying to do things a little bit more cleverly. And this paper by De Groot et al. With Kevin Agikaitis, who's a dendroclimate person doing all of the sort of science part, trying to review the complexity of the relationships between the climate data and social things. So this is all positive and it's starting to change. And we have historians starting to look at some of these sorts of data and observing things such as, although there is some sort of connection between some things like famines and food crises with both lower frequency changes like solar irradiation, so that's the top left one, and some occasional times that short-term things like big volcanic eruptions seem to match known records of famines. It's quite complicated. And in particular, Slavin, in this article in which he's reviewing this whole topic of famines and particularly the historical reassessment, notes that in nearly every major case we know, there are things that go together to, as he says, create a series of complex anthropogenic and demographic factors which, when taken together, represent that invisible beast that creates famines. Invariably, the human factor is as or more important. The famine in Ukraine under Stalin is a perfect example. Every analysis of it comes to the conclusion that although there were 2-ish years of drier, unsuitable conditions and some then wet condition on the year important, it was the way that the collective farming had been changed and the forced prices. This is what created the famine. So we know this, and the one under Mao in China is a perfect example of a political famine. But we can also say famines are perhaps the most important change on a sudden basis in history and prehistory that we know about. What do we know about most traditional societies and how they went about food, agriculture, and sustainability? Now, in the modern world, our idea of sustainability, unless you're one of those rare people practicing serious gardening at home, in which case, wonderful, good on you. it's a question of what hours is the local supermarket open, and when can I go, and this type of thing. If you're in the pre-modern world, that means before a refrigerator and some of those things like that, you actually had to worry about what you were growing, whether it could keep, how long could you store it for, and how you would therefore have some form of food security. And you were recognizing the fact that because just like yesterday, like it hailed, and today it hasn't yet, but who knows, and tomorrow it'll do something different, you recognize, and your parents will have recognized and told you, and your grandfather or grandmother will have recognized and told the family, things change all the time. You've got to allow for the fact things can go wrong. And in a number of works, so Paul Halstead and John O'Shea's book, lots of different examples, Cormac O'Grada's book and lots of examples, even their own world, Astrid Van Ooyen's book and looking at examples. Most traditional societies we know of, pre-modern societies, assumed that you had to plan for at least one bad year. So you always tried to have 1 year of riding over or stock in hand or things stored. Now, often people didn't do it. So Paul Halstead in this book, Two Ox and Head, it's great, notes the aspiration of traditional Mediterranean farms to store enough grain for a second year so it could ride one total crop failure. He then notes this, of course, was not always achieved. So it's not as if everybody's got their 1 year store ready perfectly, but people are trying to. But that's about the limit of this, because unless you bury grain in an airtight container or pit in the ground, you can't actually keep grain for that long. Yes, Joseph supposedly told Pharaoh to keep it for 7 years. And if you're in a hyper-arid environment in Egypt and you put lots of effort in it and you sealed the granary, you could actually keep it for a while. But in most situations, 0 to 2 years is about the maximum you can store nearly any agricultural product. And all of our Roman agriculture writers actually tell us that between insects and other problems, you really were doing well to store it until the next year, unless you bury it in a pit in the ground, which case you could keep it. But the moment you open that pit, and you did that because you're going to have a big feast or party, lots of Iron Age civilizations in, for example, the Western Mediterranean did this, you'd store grain in a pit, and then when some event happened, you open it and you have to consume it immediately. It goes off very quickly once you open it. It's not a way of keeping things like a prehistoric refrigerator. You can't keep just opening bits and having bits. And this book by Raphael nicely observes from the medieval Levant, for example, even well-organized regimes found it hard to cope with long periods, more than 2 years. My italics, but that's what she writes, of food shortage. And after review of granaries and storage, she concludes that, quote, the medieval Middle East was ill-equipped to battle long-term droughts and famines. And yet this was a part of the world where you're in a semi-arid environment and you knew you were going to be having bad times. So if anywhere on the planet had evolved to try and have some form of storage to ride out the bad year, it should have been the medieval Levant. And yet they could not really last more than 1 to 2 years. So that would imply that's about the key window for human things. And Cormac O'Grada, in article he wrote about this, notes historically the worst famines have been a product of back-to-back shortfalls of a staple crop, whether it be potatoes in Ireland or wheat or barley or millet, whatever it is the staple crop that people are relying on. So the climate change that's probably historically relevant is when you get 2 consecutive years that significantly harm the key resource that your population live on and feed on. Now, of course, when the first year goes wrong, you hopefully have some who have stored some stuff. Yes, you have some animals that you can probably, Paul Haster would describe as your mobile food bank. You end up, eating some of those. But once you get to the second year and it does it again, you've used up your food store. You don't have any seed left to plant anymore. So that's obviously a fundamental problem as well. And you've probably already eaten the animals that you could have eaten, or those animals are now themselves starting to be starving and the whole thing has gone very south. And clearly, if it goes on to a third year, you really are going to be in considerable difficulty. Now, what about us today? Well, one of the reasons why I think this is a topic that deserves archaeological attention is because it's interesting trying to understand how social change might have occurred at various times. But here's something archaeology can actually contribute to the present and the future, because we're no different. And apparently, in fact, we should be worried. And lots of articles keep appearing telling us that we have a very non-sustainable food supply situation. It wouldn't take 2 consecutive years of harvest failure to create problems. according to most studies, like this review of the literature, we can't survive more than a few weeks if basically the trucks and trains and ships and things don't work. And we've all now got used to looking at plots like this from the Strait of Hormuz, in which we look at all the ships going nowhere, and we can see that the world's sort of hitting some sort of major economic turmoil in the matter of weeks, yet alone 2 years. Now, the person who really, to me, recognized this first and wrote the most important book that I'm aware of on the topic, and particularly in the Mediterranean world, is Paul Peter Garnsey up here, Famine and Food Supply in the Greco-Roman World. And he identified that we tended to look at things the wrong way. So in ancient Athens, and he used traditional 20th century data to make this, he pointed out that the chance of wheat failure in any given year was about 28%. So in other words, 3/4 of the time it was fine. And barley, it was actually only 5.5%, so fairly infrequent. But the wheat could still, maybe 1 in 4 years, go west. But he said that's not the thing you're looking at, because the society is probably expecting a certain amount of, bad year. You're going to try and be storing some stuff for the next year. So what he really said was, how often do you get 2 years in a row when it goes wrong? And that's when he calculates that for wheat, that then comes down to 7.8%, and for barley, it's only 0.3%. So that's only happening literally, the sort of few times in 1,000 years that it's really going to go wrong. So actually, Athens' food supply situation wasn't that risky at all, even though you always say, well, they built Athens in a semi-marginal area. And of course, it had shipping and other connections and so on. But what you're really wondering then is, how often does this probability go wrong for you? And where might that actually be important? So for the other Donald, who's not Florida man, we're talking about that category of the unknown, the thing that the society is not evolved and planning for. And Cormac O'Grada's work, looking particularly at a number of famous cases of famines in different locations, he looks at the crop, he looks at the harvest failure possibilities, and how often you get back to back. And again, these are rare events. You rarely get such a circumstance in most places in the temperate world. So we're not talking about trying to do this in the middle of the Sahara, unless you're somewhere near an oasis, but we're talking about all of the major agriculture areas around the world. So it's a fairly uncommon phenomenon, but how often does it happen? So what do we know about how often these things might happen? Well, we're still remarkably ill-informed. Here is a plot showing all of the old meteorological records that we have telling us something about temperature. And if one just cuts out everything that's more recent than 1800, you'll spot that for most of the world, like entire Africa basically, or most of Asia, we have almost no data, and we only have 1 or 2 records that go back a few hundred years more. That's about it. If we look at precipitation, it's exactly the same story. We have 0. Up there, I can't reach, almost 0. A few records coming from parts of Asia, particularly China and Japan and Korea, and a little bit of Europe. The end result is typically, if you look up supposedly long-term temperature records that we think we are confident about, you get something like this from the Berkeley Earth Group. These are the error bars. So what they're admitting is really until we get somewhere after about 1920, we're pretty unsure. And then we think we've roughly got an idea for where things are going in the period since. Now, we really only have any form of temperature record on Earth from about the time that the little Florentine thermometer was invented and was used in a couple of different places and a couple of different versions, including one Galileo did. And one of these was used in Paris, starting off from 1658. And this is the page of the manuscript with the top left, shows the very first record of temperature. And a continuous record exists from Paris from that. And in England, not in one place, in a group of places, we have more or less a continuous temperature record as well. It's called the Central England Temperature Record. And until this manuscript was recognized, for years and years and years, the Central England one was said to be the longest continuous temperature record in the world. And in one of those great French victories, they're now 1 year longer than the Central England record. And the English one, lots of different manuscripts had to be put together to get this. Man called Manley, this was sort of life's achievement, was putting this together. And of course, the vicissitudes of how we get history is there's a gap in the record that you had to use information from Holland to try and fill. And there's this wonderful manuscript in which certain recordings were thrown out as not of further use, which now would be regarded as an invaluable manuscript record of something we'd really like to know about, which was what was temperature being measured in 1707 to 1720s. So from these records, you can put together continuous Paris and central England temperature records, which you can see are remarkably well correlated. So I've correlated it up the top left by just putting a little fudge factor in, and by doing that, they're literally the same. It's just generally Paris is slightly warmer than central England, which is not a surprise if you've ever caught a train and gone south. And you can also notice that it's been getting generally warmer across that time. And we can note there's the occasional extraordinary event, like this by far the coldest event in the last 600 years, which happens in 1 year. So how often do you get 2 consecutive years of something really dramatic happening? And the answer is incredibly rarely. So in red with the asterisk is when it's happening in the Central England record, and the black asterisk is when it's happening in Paris. And before we get to the last couple of decades, there's only one such 2-year plus event happening in Central England, one in Paris. Since 1989, 2024, fine. We all know we seem to be in this new era of climate change. So we can say something dramatic's happening up on the top right there. But for hundreds of years, it's very rare to get 2 dramatic, more than 2 standard deviation from an average event occurring in a row, as opposed to dramatic little blips going up and down. Now, all around the world, we now have increasing evidence of long-term climate, and with different densities. So a lot of South America, nothing. A lot of Africa, nothing. A lot of Australia, not very much, but then, and so on. But lots of places have records. But the only source that we have of really good high-resolution climate information from a lot of the terrestrial planet is from tree rings, because done properly, these are giving you information by the year, absolute, and even often can resolve to the season. So spring to early summer in the early wood, and the late wood, the darker bands here, gives you the summer record. And people have done this now for some time, and it created the original sort of climate controversy, Michael Mann's hockey curve, which is the plot that you see over there, in which it seems that everything has gone quite dramatically differently in the last couple of decades. Fairly instantaneously, you go and find a tree, like a Pinus nigra tree here. You find it particularly in an area where it's growing on the margins of its adaptation. So cypress, you'll see, is the southeastern sort of most extreme place that it lives. So these trees are probably going to be very sensitive to change because they're on the margins of what they're adapted to. You go and find the wood. You can then measure the wood, the top one, and the grey is showing how many trees you have for the year. So these records always get a bit more dodgy as you go further back because you have less and less data. And you can then do statistics on that and try and compare the changes that you see against the instrumental periods, so the last 100 years where we have actual instrumental meteorological data, and you find where the correlation seems to be. So you can basically explain spring to early summer to summer rainfall by the size of the ring. You correlate that together, so the top right with meteorological information over the period that you have, which is not very long, and then you extrapolate backwards to try and give you the best record. An obvious question to say, so you have about 100 years, then extrapolate back hundreds of years. How do you know that's right? You don't. But it's the best technique we have available at this point. And there are some ways, particularly using stable isotopes, to try and do it more independently of a fudge factor. And that allows you to try and come up with rainfall in millimeters. And you can observe things like the mid-14th century seems to be relatively dry. Around about 1500 is relatively dry. Around 1850. 1950, and other periods are wetter. So this is how you go about building up such a climate record. And people also look at late wood density, particularly as a measure of temperature, and work's been done in several places, particularly in Fennoscandia, because again, these trees are growing at the margins of where trees can grow northwards, so they're very temperature sensitive. And this allows people to put together records of June, July, August, summer temperature. And you can see lots of extremes, lots of blips going up and down. Very few multi-year extremes, almost invariably single-year ones. So it's the pattern we observe. 1 year's this, another year's that. 1 year's this, another year's that. So and occasional interesting things like the fact that 34 CE remains actually as hot as it's been any time in the last few decades. So we're not uniquely hot yet, but the worrying thing is we seem to have rather more hot summers going on now than we have most of the last 2,000 years. So let's look at the Mediterranean and just wonder, well, so how does a case work? What might we say about years in which you get consecutive failures? Well, typically, if you look at a record like the Balkan Anatolian oak record from parts of the first millennium, it's just like the ones we looked at. It goes up and down, and there's just once you get an extreme event, more than 2 sigma from the mean, but it's 1 year. Almost 2, but not quite. So you might say that could be interesting. But most of the time, it's not extreme. So it's quite rare. Lots of years go by, many lifetimes go by, and you don't get such events. And if we look over hundreds of years, the stars are showing the ones with extreme, little triangles and crosses as well. They're all pretty well spaced out in whole long periods that have nothing, like 200 years. And the same in the more recent period. And altogether, over the period we have data, there's only twice, 1607, 1608, and then interesting enough, 2 almost years straight after, and 1927, 1928. They're the only time in centuries and centuries that you get 2 consecutive years with really, really dry conditions. Now, we know what happened in 1927-8. Ataturk was in charge. He had telephone, he had vehicles. It was a 4% hit on Turkish GDP, which is like quite extraordinary change, but the regime survived. The one that happened at the beginning of the 17th century, well, this led to this huge drought across this whole area here. And it's the time of what's called the Jalali Rebellion. So this almost brought the Ottoman Empire down. There was a huge peasant revolt and tax revolt because people were starving. And it didn't bring them down, but it's the biggest challenge the Ottoman Empire faced until its actual end after World War I. So what about other times? And here's some work that we did a couple of years ago. We looked at the Hittite world. So this is again Central Anatolia, huge big empire controlling most of this vast region. Empire had been in existence for about 500 years by the time we get to 1200 BCE. We know quite a bit about them because, amongst other things, they fought a battle of Kadesh, that's here, against the Egyptian empires, the Hittite Empire, the Egyptian Empire. They fought. Nobody really won. They made a peace deal, and they then proceeded to write letters to each other. So from that point onwards, we actually know that the Egyptians are discussing sending a doctor to the Hittite king because it's one of the hilarious ones. The Hittites are looking to see if they could get assistance with a female relative who would like to have children. The Egyptian ruler tries to tactfully point out that given he understands the woman is of a certain age, that seems highly unlikely to be possible, but nonetheless he's going to send a physician, and peace breaks out and remains that way until the end of the Late Bronze Age. There's always hopes for the present world for a lesson there as well. So the Hittite capital, Hattusha, if you haven't been there, massive things. It's hectares and hectares of big things. You might walk up this ramp, it's enormous, etc. So huge civilization. And all of these kings that we have. And then in the reign of Shapuriyama II, who comes to the throne according to the standard Trevor Bryce chronology, but about then, comes to the throne about 1207. And at a certain point in his reign, he simply vanishes from history. And it's not just he vanishes from history, the Hittites vanish from history. There's a written archive for all of these periods, and there is no written Hittite archival text after a certain point in his reign. So an entire civilization, doesn't mean everybody died, but the entire operation of government and of an empire stopped at some point in his reign, which is normally placed around about 1198, 1196. And we know that they relied on grain. They built huge granaries like this one here. And we know, based on this and other early such states, that the cereal production and grain supply would have been key to feeding the population of the capital, supporting the huge army that they had, and generally maintaining the tax and other sort of support system that they had going. And there's been lots of excavations, and there are climate records available from a couple of caves. And at the site of Gordian, we have some tree rings. So in a tomb, it's called the Midas Mound Humulus, probably actually uncle or grandparent of King Midas, year of legend, but nonetheless, you have this tomb, which is entirely built out of trees, particularly juniper, like these ones. You have whole sections of the wood, There's a picture of what it looks like today. It looks like a Rodney Young chainsaw already way through it. You'd be arrested these days, but this was how archaeology was done 80 years ago. And we get tree ring records. We can correlate those records all together. So all of the values here, these are t-scores. When they're big numbers, well above 5 or 6, it's really good pretty correlation. Only the ones in grey don't work that well. So all of these trees work together in a really impressive network. And we then can try and look to see how does that growth correlate with climate response. So what you do is you say, well, when the trees are young, they grow bigger because that's what everybody does. When you start little, you grow quickly and then you settle down when you get older. So bigger growth to start with. And the red line, we're taking out an expected growth curve. So there are a couple of different ways of doing this, but these are two of the common ones. And the graph down the bottom is telling how many trees we have per year. So where we have lots of trees, we're fairly confident. Where we've got almost none, we're not very confident. And we can therefore come up with a age-dependent spline out of those growth curves, which we think is actually giving us the environmental or the climate signal. It's taken away the growth trend and other sort of exogenous factors that might be causing things. And we can see where we have lots of samples. And we can then ask, what are the lowest 6.2% of values? Why 6.2%? Simply because those were the years that the wheat harvest failed at that percentage in the period we have modern meteorological records. So about that often in this region, the wheat harvest failed. And you'll notice that it happens very occasionally, like not at all for 200 years. Here, we don't have many trees, so just let's forget that one. To be honest, we don't have very many trees here, so we could probably forget that. Once, when we have lots of trees, we have 3 years in a row where we have results in the lowest 6.25%. So same sort of information, that's all of it plotted here ups and downs. Here's the particular period in which we're seeing it going up and down. And you have this little group of 3 consecutive years right together, which are in this real area. You're getting 4 years all the time, every now and again, but then it springs back. Just once, you get 3 consecutive years in 600 years of good record. And it's not all by itself, because you can look at stable isotope information from these tree rings, particularly carbon-13 in a semi-arid environment, gives you a very good water availability proxy. So we can see what's that telling us about drought at that time. And there's a couple of collaborators. There's Liam, for those who know Liam. And Brie Lorenzen is one of my co-authors on this, and Kim Sparks, who runs the isotope lab. And what we can observe is that in the trees for the first few hundred years of the record, it's actually generally reasonable water availability. And in the second half of the record, suddenly it's moved to generally more arid. So not only do we have this 3-year incredibly dry period, but it's happening after we've moved to this much drier regime. So this is a case of times have already moved to be stressful, and now we have 3 dramatically dry years. So it's not like everybody's been having a terrific time, then suddenly 1 year it goes wrong, and you'd hope they've all got their store ready. People are probably already under stress. Animals are already under stress. So we have this situation in which climate change can create long-term general forcing conditions, affecting strategies of adaptation and resilience. And that's what we expect people to be adapted to and used to, and create practices for resilience and sustainability. But every now and again, we're going to have one of these types of events of multi-year dramatic exception, which are going to challenge nearly every normal human adaptive model that we've had in the planet so far. And I suggest very much our one today, because we're relying on the whole just-in-time model to support most of our things. So, I mean, the takeaway is, why should we do archaeology, apart from the fact it's fascinating and interesting and all those sorts of arguments? But it actually has real relevance, because this is a way of understanding what are the risks that we face. And in the radiocarbon field, there was an argument for a while, should we be worried about space weather and the likelihood that we're going to get, knocked off by the next Miyake event coming our way. And that's highly relevant in a sense. But these things happen every few centuries, as opposed to maybe occasionally millennia between them. And we can see pretty clear documented cases of what happens when it really goes wrong. And does it just happen in places like Central Anatolia? Well, no. A really terrific paper that was out last year, graduate student in Cambridge and colleagues, highlighted the fact that just the same 2-year consecutive very dry period in Britain and Northwest Europe seems to correlate and go a long way towards explaining the so-called barbarian conspiracy in the 4th century and changes that otherwise had not been well explained. So rare and occasional, but highly historically significant, and something that we should be worried about for the future, but also it's a reason to be reconsidering how we go about doing history, linking climate. We aren't looking for occasional low frequency patterns. We aren't just looking for generalized associations. We have to look for these specific events and the linkages. Thank you very much.
Okay, Robin is just stopping recording in case any of you are shy questions. Anyway, so we've got some time for some questions. I'd like to raise any.
There we go.